I'm Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education. This session today is going to focus on trying to define something that's pretty amorphous, but very important. What is Israel education? Noga Cohavi comes to us from Haifa. She is an Israeli educator and participant in a Jewish peoplehood program. She spends time independently working with teachers and with the Ministry of Education. Aaron Bregman is working for the American Jewish Committee as Associate Director of their High School Affairs program. Aaron has got more than a decade of experience as a day school educator working at the Charles E. Smith School in Rockville, Maryland. And he was also involved in the David Project way back when, writing school curriculum. And of course, there's Tal Grinfas-David, who is our Vice President for Outreach and Pre-Collegiate Work at CIE. She became an elementary school principal of the Epstein School here in Atlanta in 2011 and joined us and our staff maybe 5 or 7 years earlier than that. And she's managed to stick with us since, adding a wonderful dimension to our work, working with teachers and methods and pedagogy and best practices and how do you define success in the classroom. What is Israel education from your point of view, and what was it like when you started as a student, and what is it like now as a teacher practitioner?
Israel education has always been part of Jewish education. Unfortunately, Jewish education became poorer and poorer as years passed. There are less Torah lessons, less emphasis on Hebrew, less knowledge of history of Israel. It started as policy of the Ministry of Education while working very hard on holy studies, meaning mathematics and English. But when it came to Tanakh, Hebrew literature, Hebrew language skills, mother tongue skills, history of Israel, Jewish ethics, peoplehood, all of these were neglected more and more. The startup nation forgot its origins.
I'm 37, so for me, I went to public school up in Boston, North Shore, Boston. So for me, it all happened probably early 2000s, around the Second Intifada, when I began to recognize what was happening in the region, in Israel, and I became more involved and interested. That's at the time when organizations like Stand With Us, Camera, Honest Reporting, all this sort of Israel Hasbara organizations really began to pop up. If you looked on campus, it was sort of like that 5% on one side was yelling at the 5% on the other side, and everyone in the middle was just like, what is happening here? There's a great resource. It's called Why Israel? Reviewing Israel Education Through the Lens of Civic and Political Engagement by Alex Thompson, which came out in 2012. And what he said, which really influenced me, was that Jewish day school students felt that they were being lied to, essentially. That they were going to campus not knowing what the Nakba was, or not understanding discrimination, let's say, of Mizrahi Jews in Israel. In the 10 years I taught at JDS, and I just left this past June, I really saw that emergence really begin to take shape and actually be a really productive aspect of how kids are starting to think about and learn about Israel today. So when we talk about Israel education, big idea, right? What grade age are we talking about? Is teaching something like the Six-Day War to fifth graders relevant? I don't know, maybe. But each school, grade, classroom teacher needs to figure out how they want to define Israel education for themselves. I don't think it's one specific term. I think there's an alternative side to what I just asked, which is how do you choose what not to teach to, say, like 12th graders who want everything in all sides of the information? And to me, Israel education is about multiple perspectives, right? Whether it's like Ashkenazi, Mizrahi views, Likud, labor, Druze, Bedouin, even Arab Israelis or Palestinians, because we have to give these kids that sort of context and background. And the idea is they want to be able to engage in that history, politics, culture, and the complexity around what Israel stands for, what it means to people who care about it. When you give kids all that, fostering critical thinking skills and being able to give their own voice to how they see Israel today, at the end of the day, Israel is on the side of like, wow, I really want to go there. I want to visit there. I want to learn about it more. I think there's two critical functions. I think there's the academic prowess, but just as important is Ahavat Israel, right? Love of Israel, Hasbara, right? But I see those as separate. As a trained history teacher, I'm trained to hide my politics, hide my biases. And I have very strong beliefs about Israel. I love Israel. I love the people. I love everything about it. But I believe that kids need to have that context.
In Israel, when I was teaching in a high school level, I had a student come to me and say, I'm not going to participate in the Memorial Day for the Holocaust because, and he said to me in Hebrew, "Ze lo achag shelanu," and he used the word holiday. It's not our holiday. And he happened to be from Sephardic background. At the time when we were teaching in Israel, it was a very European-centric, very Holocaust-centric, very founders, socialism, kibbutz movement-centric kind of narrative to Israeli history. And I saw that shift dramatically in the last 30 years. The Israeli school system is divided up into 4. And so when you talk about the secular school system versus the religious school system, there are vast differences in terms of what is taught and how it is taught. Growing up in a secular school system, we received our peoplehood elsewhere, from the Scouts, from the movies we watched, from the extracurricular activities that we engaged in with one another, and the sort of civic activism that we engaged in politically, which young people are very encouraged to do in Israel, at least when I was growing up. And we saw the shift from the founders and that philosophy to privatization in the 80s and the emphasis on the individual, which I think is what we're sort of feeling nostalgic about these days. When I came to the United States, Israel education was Holocaust education. There was no Israel education, and it was only done by the Israelis with no continuity or spiral in sophistication from one grade level to the next. And it was whatever they thought was important to focus on, individuals in their classrooms with the door closed. There was no expectation of what graduates should have. I've seen the pendulum shift dramatically over the last 30 years. I have seen schools really focus on Israel education, create courses, plug into the master's scheduled time, but it has become entirely the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I spoke about in the previous session, and not focused enough on Israeli history, culture, society, politics, sports, etc., etc. We're not looking deeply enough into Israel as a democracy, as a vibrant place where Jewish identity stems from. And we need to really think about how we refocus, reshape, and prioritize the what and the who. And this is a place where I want to sort of give a shout out to a particular school in Vancouver, where 2 educators who are not Jewish are taking on Israel integration into STEAM. And so this question of, does it have to fit only into Judaic studies, or should it only be taught by Jewish teachers or by Israelis, I think is the next hurdle that we have to overcome together. As one of those teachers said to me, listen, I've never been to the moon, but I teach about the moon.
Many years ago, we used to have in Israel, in the Mamlachti educational system, a subject called Yedi'at Haaretz, knowing the land of Israel. And it was beautiful. And it brought the children closer to the love of Eretz Israel. We also had a subject called Moledet, homeland, and it was wonderful, but these do not exist anymore. We have a joint challenge, and we have to work it out together. And we have to talk about Jewish education and education for Israel in the same conversation.
The sense I've received over these 40 years is that discussion of the Shoah has to some degree sucked the oxygen out of learning other things that relate to Jewish history. And the second item is the Arab-Israel conflict. Aaron referred to it earlier. What did you not tell us? As if teachers 20 years ago actually knew what to leave out, and they did it intentionally. I need to find out exactly what was the it that was left out. If they're talking about what happened between 45 and 49, maybe. But are they talking about Arab society in Palestine? Are they talking about how Zionists organized? Are they talking about why Zionism was initially catalyzed? I don't suspect so. I think it's an easy cop-out, a very easy cop-out to say they didn't teach it to us. And the reaction now is the overreaction. I think the dominance in America since the late 50s has been the Shoah is the single most important event in modern Jewish identity, not even the creation of the state of Israel. I mean, how many Israel museums do we have in North America as compared to how many Holocaust museums? What do you think teachers in North America wish they had more of in terms of their ability to communicate what is Israel?
If you work in a school, for example, an elementary middle school, where the mission statement of the school says, and Ahavat Israel, and there is no curriculum guide, no substance, no primary sources, no units written to even be passed from one teacher to the next, what is a teacher to understand their role to be? And so when you get graduates who come and say, you lied to me, or you didn't tell me, it's because teachers with good intentions have been trying to imbue students with a connection and a love to Israel that is devoid of content or of anything negative. You can't say anything negative about Israel because then the students won't love it. And so they've sort of selected and picked it because what are you to do when you don't have the guidance of the administration, when you don't have the supporting documents, and you want your students to love Israel? You teach it through rosy lenses. And I think what we're coming to is this understanding for all of us to have standards and benchmarks for Israel education that are based on the national curriculum for social studies that align with best practices in education so that you can actually design and craft units and materials using that and using the resources that are available to actually provide your students with depth and understanding, not to dumb things down, but to make them age appropriate and accessible, and not to teach only that which is positive about Israel, but to teach the reality of it without fear that it will cause less connection or less love. What do teachers need? They need supportive, confident, and ready to battle for them administrators, and those are far and few between. These administrators are embattled themselves between donors who are polarized on the left and on the right, and who say, if you don't teach Israel this way, I'll pull my funds, I'll pull my children out of your school. And we can't operate in a healthy way in that kind of a setting.
Was it intentional to leave out issues about the conflict? I would say, no, I don't think it was intentional per se. By growing up during the early 2000s, between the media shifting, the Second Intifada obviously bringing such limelight to the region, and obviously you go before that with the Oslo Accords and bringing the Palestinians to the international view, kids my age began like, wait, why was this happening? What is happening here? The administrators need to be more confident and stand up, particularly to parents. There needs to be a more sense of what are we doing? What is our goal? And not just react all the time and just assume that whatever is happening with Israel is this black and white issue.
Israel education is not reacting to contemporary politics. It's not the personality in the politics. It's not Bibi and Trump. Bibi and Trump are only the last 20 years, and the 67 war is only 50 years. We're talking about 3,000 years of history and how Israel evolves out of Jewish history. Noga, as far as Israel is concerned, do you think teachers in high school have 3 or 4 general ideas that they would like to convey to their students in telling them what Israel is? How much freedom is given to the individual teacher in high school to determine what they need to teach?
Freedom is not the problem. Ignorance is the problem. It's hard words, but this is the truth. And I'm happy that you mentioned here the 2 biggest obstacles in our educational discourse. And the first one is politicization of the discourse of our sikha. And the second is indoctrination. Without knowing the basics, without knowing facts, when they have the power to indoctrinate students instead of educate and teach about, for instance, Chevrat Mofet rather than Or LaGoyim, which is something totally different. Or LaGoyim is from the Tanakh, it's from Isaiah, light unto the nations. Israel is expected, according to our prophets, to be light unto the nations. It gradually changed to Chevrat Mofet, model society, utopia. So from the authentic, we went to politically deceiving, and this is very bad. So these are 2 booby traps, politicization and indoctrination.
I was also a Mora Chayelet, a soldier teacher. You know, when we were trained to work even with at-risk teens or to work in areas of poverty or to work with different groups and with different goals, the idea was not indoctrinate, but incentivize contributing to the collective. The collective was such a big ideal for the good of Israel, for the good of the nation, right? And we were pumped. I mean, we were fed this stuff since we were fed mother's milk. That's what you were there to do. That culture and vibrancy produces really great things, great leaders, people who take initiative and tackle difficult problems. But it also is a little bit of a caricature of ourselves. And you have to admit as an adult that that wanes with time and you become a little bit jaded and you start teaching your frustrations with the political system. And I think that's also natural. I mean, we look at the trajectory of teachers' careers. They're not teaching the same way at year 5 as they are at year 25.
I was teaching a conflict class, and a student asked me when we were debriefing the semester, he's like, when you started at JDS in 2012 and you were having like this sort of last class debrief of the course, is our conversation today any different? I had to think like, besides Bibi not being prime minister at this moment, right? And yes, there were less Gaza wars at the time, but like otherwise, I could have taught the same class in 2012 as I did today, which I essentially have while changing some things around. So I think to your point is that like teachers need to evolve and change. Israel as a country has evolved too. But in terms of the ideas, it hasn't changed all that much.
I think there's a demographic change in America, at least amongst American Jews, people who are age 40 and below and those who are 45 or 50 and above. If you want to recall the Ford, Carter, or Reagan administrations, you probably have to be at least 45 years old. Otherwise, you learned it in the textbook. And what you learn in a textbook is very different than what you experience. If you hadn't had the Six-Day War and Israel hadn't won, would you have had the Soviet Jewry movement? Because, world Jewry got really pumped up because of the Six-Day War and Israel's success, and Soviet Jewry got really pumped up about their identity. We can go back and do what-ifs in history, but I think the demography makes a difference, and I think the social media has made the difference. If you had to define 1 or 2 or 3 concepts that you felt were absolutely essential to impart to a Jew in Boston or Beersheba or in Buenos Aires about what is Israel, what would those 3 concepts be that have nothing to do with borders?
Israel is a natural continuation of thousands of years of Jewish history and connection to the land. And that connection is ever evolving. That's number 1.
Natural continuity.
I think the triangle, המשולש, החוט המשולש of Torat Israel, Am Israel, and Eretz Israel should be taught everywhere. The people of Israel, the Torah, and Eretz Israel, all 3 of them should be interpreted in as many ways as possible, based on as many examples as possible, through different prismas, but I think this is the core. This is how we should teach Israel, to enjoy richer Zionist literacy, Israeli literacy, Jewish literacy.
So I taught a class called History of Modern Israel to 11th graders every year for the last 10 years. Our first day of class, I always said, where should we begin this class? Modern Israel. What does that mean to you? And kids would throw out 48, 67. They'd go back to ancient medieval times. And obviously the idea of Zionism, right? The sort of late 19th century foundations. To me, starting there, understanding the different Zionist philosophies, understanding how the modern day country came to be. You begin there with obviously the ideas of Herzl and how that translated later on.
Is there an underlying concept?
It's power and freedom. Sovereignty matters, freedom matters. And the way to achieve that is to acquire power and learn how to wield it. And power is the acronym for those units that you need to teach. It's peoplehood, critical mass, and the glue, right? It's the organizations that you need to sustain yourself, your political organization, your infrastructure, building roads, hospitals, education, et cetera, et cetera. It's water and vital resources, be it oil, natural gas, what have you, most of which doesn't exist in Israel. It's the economy that has to stay resilient in times of threat. And it's recognition from international bodies, superpowers, your neighboring states, and the non-state actors. And if you can do that 5 and you can explain to a student that power is not a dirty word, but when you don't have it, you don't have the ability to take in the ingathering of the exiles. You don't have the ability to control your own destiny, and you can't produce normalized relations with others.
I think all those things that you said are fantastic, but give me a topic, give me an area that I should focus more on, because I feel like we're using these big themes, but we're not narrowing it down to a time frame I need to give these kids to learn more about.
Take
Focus on
any
it.
I'll give you
period
one.
and explore it through that lens.
The dramatic encounter of East and West in Israel. I think this is a very good issue you can start with.
The underlying concept is Jewish self-determination. Jews have the right to determine their own future. And they struggled to make that happen. And they acquired power. And they made mistakes along the way. And they did all the things that were necessary to acquire it and to sustain it. Israel Kolat, a Zionist historian, said the difference between Zionists and the Jews who came before is that the Zionists intervened in history. That's the underlying concept. They took destiny into their own hands and they decided to go forth. Did they screw up along the way? Many times. Did they have successes along the way? Many times. But the underlying concept for me, and what I found in the classroom, is the whole idea of being able to do it and succeeding at it, making mistakes, and changing your tactics, but not the strategy.
Is that for any age? Or is that a certain higher level of understanding?
You can build it age appropriately. I mean, Tal will give you a 45-hour lecture on why it is appropriate at any level. Noga, give us your instructions or give us your ideas on how this can best be conveyed or how you've conveyed it.
Actually, I'm working on it at the moment. The Ministry of Education gave some of us a budget to develop teaching learning units. All of them are going to be computerized, obviously. They will be free online, translated to several languages. And when we sat down to discuss, okay, what will the organizing element be? There were people who thought that it might be a good idea that the organizing element is one of the prominent personalities, a unit for Ben-Gurion, a unit for Henrietta Sold. But then you leave out so many personalities. Another suggestion was dilemma or a big idea. And eventually we decided that the main organizing element would be Jewish ethics. So we have 10 units. One is organized around tzedek. Tzedek and justice are not the same, but I don't have any better translation. Cheirut, freedom, again, lost in translation. Chokhmah, wisdom, responsibility, and arvut adadit, all Israel are responsible for one another, etc. Now, what do we have in each unit? In all of them, we have the dilemma part, a model that I developed, which is called Sela Amachloket. I don't know how you say it in English. Maybe literally it will be the rock of dispute, but again, lost in translation. Dilemmas and ideas, the Israeli spirit, which includes innovation, youth movements, the IDF, sport, culture, anything that goes into the Israeli spirit. Also, we have the part of nature and landscape, personalities, but via artificial intelligence. So students can chat with Ben-Gurion, whoever they choose, institutions and organizations, and obviously the timeline of the Hebrew calendar, defining events, national events, Jewish events, and there is a special host in each and every unit. There's a plant like the kalanit, I don't know how you say it in English, the national flower. Also duchifa, the national bird. And so we took from the nature, the host, flowers, trees, animals, Eretz Israel flowers. And we use the personalization, and I think it is coming very nicely. No apologetic parts, no advocacy. Yes, a lot of arguments, good arguments, machloket leshem shamayim. And also there is a virtual daf beit midrashi in each unit, a collection of meaningful texts from the Jewish bookcase, from the Tanakh, Mishnah, Talmud.
Is it necessary still to teach advocacy, or can we just get away from it?
I think it's absolutely important to teach advocacy. I just think it's important to have a very structured environment when advocacy fits into, particularly in a school. I think it's important to separate when advocacy is being given or being taught versus when we have a classroom academic sort of structure. I think in the past, a lot of students are very confused or conflicted on when there is advocacy being taught to them and when they're trying to be given a more academic rigor, where it creates more critical thinking or civil discourse.
Advocacy has yet to prove that it's actually effective, and most of the data collected to date tells us that the graduates of these programs are not able to advocate for Israel. No teen wants to be told what to think and what to say. When you hear X, you should say Y. That's completely the antithesis of my experience of working with teens and the way that they learn. But also because advocacy requires a certain background set of skills and content knowledge that our students will never have by the end of 12th grade. If it's just, hurrah, I support Israel, that's a very different thing than advocacy.
If a parent says to you, what do you mean Israel advocacy is not a thing anymore? My son and daughter shouldn't be involved in something like that. Like, what do you say?
I talk to them a lot about what has happened on campus and what we've learned and what we've seen. And the large majority of students come to campus and they're not pumped to go shout at somebody across the way who's doing a lie-in or who's striking or who's, BDS or whatever. It can't get to the point where we have placed the burden on our young learners, and 18 is young, to fight for and advocate for Israel in the face of hate and bigotry. We have to change that world for them. But what they can do is learn their own story, not through the lens of someone else, but through their own history.
Do we step back and say there aren't basic things that they should know? Or do we just say, sure, wherever you want to be, I'll take you further and deepen your knowledge of Israel?
You might have a student who's fully checked out and who really loves soccer. What are you going to do? You got to start introducing them to Maccabi Tel Aviv and Hapoel, Yerushalayim, and you have to talk about Shiri Maimon singing Hatikva. We have to find ways to engage students who are completely disconnected, while at the same time, sometimes through the back door and being creative, giving them the essence of Israel literacy.
Can Israel be taught without trips?
I don't think so. If I'm not mistaken, all the studies, everything I've always read always says the way to really engage kids is to bring them there, right? Whether it's through language, culture. Once they're there, everything they've learned in the past connects to being on the ground.
Only a third of American Jews actually end up visiting Israel. So what do we say? 2/3 of American Jewry is done for?
Well,
I think there's a bigger question here, which is how many teachers do we get to go to Israel?
I think it's also important to recognize it's not just, Jewish adults or Jewish educators that need to go who haven't been before or haven't been in a long time. Think about the private schools. The administrators have zero knowledge when there's the rise of anti-Semitism or there's another Israel engagement and war in the Middle East. They don't know what their students are going through. So if you can take those administrators, those non-Jews who don't have that connection and bring them there, it might open more windows.
I'd like to just re-emphasize the need to be more inclusive of who is considered an Israel educator. And let's help them and train them and help them become part of the conversation, because it's just as important that if Israel is so important to Jewish identity, it can't just be a tiny portion of Judaic studies in that side of the day. We want to have teachers of math and science and social studies and all these other wonderful fields take part in teaching about Israel.
People spoke earlier about identity. And to me, it's all about getting them connected to the land itself, getting them to connect to what Israel means to them, and helping push that boundary in terms of understanding the critical context of how that all engages, again, through history, culture, politics, whatever they're interested in, you got to engage the individual students.
There are communities and Jewish groups in different countries that cannot come to Israel, yet they know a lot about the Israeli reality. I've been working with the Jewish community in Jerba, Tunisia, and you cannot imagine how much they know without visiting Israel. Obviously, we don't have a diplomatic relationship between the two countries, so it is possible. It demands engagement of the entire family. It takes not only a village, it takes the entire community and other friends to raise a good Jewish child.
Kehila worldwide.